Eleanor moved through the mansion like a ghost drifting through a palace she never truly belonged to. The floors gleamed like mirrors, chandeliers sparkled like falling stars, and the air was always scented with expensive fragrances chosen by someone who never asked what she liked. Everyone who visited said she was so lucky that Damon Royce had given her a life other women only dreamed of. They saw the marble staircases, the indoor garden, the private chefs, the designer dresses. What they never saw, what she worked so hard to hide, were the bruises beneath those dresses or the tremor in her voice whenever Damon entered a room. She always spoke softly, not out of gentleness but fear, measuring each word like stepping stones across a river where one wrong step meant drowning. She used long sleeves even during warm afternoons, pretending she felt cold because of pregnancy. Each layer of makeup served as a shield, covering faded marks she prayed no one would question. Friends would smile and touch her belly lovingly, saying pregnancy must be tiring, that she looked pale, that she should rest more. Eleanor would nod, offering small, practiced smiles. None of them knew why she barely slept, why her heart raced whenever her phone buzzed, why she flinched at sudden sounds. Damon was adored publicly, a charming, charismatic millionaire with a dazzling smile. Cameras loved him. Investors trusted him. People clapped when he entered rooms. No one knew what he became when the doors closed. In private, he was unpredictable, sharp-tongued, and easily enraged. Eleanor kept hoping he would soften once the baby arrived, that fatherhood would gentle him, that love would change him. But deep inside, in the quiet corners of her heart, she feared nothing would ever change, except her own strength fading a little more each day. Damon's temper grew like a storm that never ended, always waiting just beyond the horizon, ready to strike at the smallest shift in the wind. Eleanor never knew what would set him off. Sometimes it was a misplaced glass, sometimes a question he didn't like, sometimes simply the way she breathed when he was stressed. He started accusing her of being ungrateful, throwing the word like a knife every time she tried to voice an opinion. If she suggested resting because her back hurt, he snapped. If she asked to visit a friend, he sneered that she was planning to gossip about him. Soon, he demanded access to everything, her password, her phone, her messages. He monitored her social media, controlled her credit cards, and insisted she inform him of every step she took inside the house, claiming it was for her safety. Arguments never stayed small. Even the mildest disagreement spiraled into shouting. His face would twist with rage, veins standing out across his neck as he towered over her, pointing, yelling, breaking objects to make her flinch. Eleanor tried to shrink into herself, keeping her voice soft, her movements calm, hoping to avoid triggering him. But nothing worked. His moods were unpredictable, shifting from fake tenderness to explosive fury in seconds. She eventually began sleeping in the guest room, pretending it was for comfort during pregnancy. The truth was darker. She feared turning her back to him at night. She feared waking to his anger or a hand gripping her arm too tightly. When she lay awake, feeling the baby flutter weakly, a new fear crept into her chest. What if the stress harmed the child? What if Damon's temper didn't stop at bruises? She felt trapped inside the mansion that looked like paradise but felt like a prison, isolated from everyone she loved, terrified of the man who vowed to protect her. The dinner party was supposed to impress Damon's newest investors, a group of powerful men whose approval meant millions for his latest project. The mansion buzzed with chatter, crystal glasses clinking, and soft classical music drifting through the air. Eleanor moved carefully among the guests, offering polite smiles, her hand resting protectively over her growing belly. She had spent the entire day preparing, overseeing the chefs, supervising the setup, making sure everything was perfect because Damon hated imperfections more than anything. But as the evening wore on, exhaustion crept into her bones. The lights felt too bright, the perfume too heavy, and the stress pressed against her chest like a weight. When Damon wrapped an arm around her waist for show, pulling her close as he spoke with his investors, she leaned in and whispered gently, "I'm feeling a little unwell. I think I should lie down for a moment." It was quiet, barely audible, meant only for him. But his body stiffened instantly. The smile on his face didn't move, but his eyes flashed cold. Without breaking the conversation, he slid his hand under the table and clamped it around her wrist. His fingers squeezed with deliberate pressure, sending a bolt of pain shooting up her arm. Eleanor gasped softly, her breath catching, but the guests didn't notice. Damon continued speaking smoothly about market projections, never loosening his grip. He leaned toward her, still smiling at the investors, and muttered through clenched teeth, "Don't you dare embarrass me. You stay right here." Each word dripped with warning. Eleanor nodded quickly, her heart racing as she tried to pull her wrist free, but his grip tightened even more. She felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she blinked them back, forcing herself to keep her expression neutral. She didn't want anyone to see. She didn't want to cause a scene that would cost Damon his temper later. Throughout the rest of dinner, every movement she made felt painfully aware of the bruising fingers wrapped around her skin. The laughter around her sounded distant, unreal, as if she wasn't truly part of the room. In that moment, Eleanor realized something terrifying: Damon's temper wasn't just unpredictable anymore. It was escalating. And she no longer had the strength to pretend everything was normal. The moment the last guest left, Damon's smile vanished like a mask ripped from his face. The door hadn't even fully closed when he rounded on Eleanor, his eyes burning with rage. "Do you have any idea what you did tonight?" he hissed, stepping toward her as she backed into the foyer wall. She blinked in confusion, still rubbing the wrist he had crushed under the table. I didn't do anything," she whispered, her voice trembling. Damon slammed his hand against the wall beside her head, making her jump. "You humiliated me," he snarled. Whispering like a child, acting sick, making me look like a husband chained to a fragile wife. "My investors saw everything." Eleanor shook her head quickly, terrified by the fury radiating off him. "I just felt unwell. I didn't want to cause a scene. I wasn't trying to embarrass you." But her explanation only fueled him. "Always excuses," he spat. "You think you can talk back now? You think being pregnant gives you power?" He grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her toward the center of the room. For months, she had stayed silent, swallowing pain and fear, trying to keep the peace. But something inside her had cracked long before her bones did. With shaking breath, she finally said the words she had kept buried for too long. "You can't treat me like property, Damon. I'm your wife, not something you own." Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was enough to ignite him. His face contorted with blind rage. "How dare you," he growled. Without warning, he twisted her arm violently. Eleanor cried out, the sound raw and terrified, but he didn't stop. He twisted harder, fury driving every motion until a sickening crack split the air. Pain exploded through Eleanor's body, bright and blinding. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, clutching her arm as waves of agony crashed through her. The room spun, her vision blurring, her breath coming in shaky gasps. Damon stood over her, chest heaving, looking almost surprised at what he'd done, but not enough to help her. Not enough to care. Eleanor's tears hit the polished floor as she realized the truth: this wasn't just cruelty anymore. Damon had become truly dangerous. Eleanor lay on the floor for several seconds, gasping through the throbbing agony shooting up her broken arm. Damon had stepped back, pacing like a man irritated by a minor inconvenience rather than horrified by what he'd done. That small window, those few moments where he wasn't watching her, became her only chance. Fighting through the pain and dizziness, she forced herself up with her good arm, steadying her trembling legs. Her purse lay on a nearby table, and she staggered toward it, every step sending fresh waves of pain through her body. She grabbed it just as Damon turned toward her again. "Where do you think you're going?" he demanded, taking a step forward. Panic surged through her, sharp and overwhelming. She didn't answer, she couldn't. She pushed herself toward the door, adrenaline carrying her faster than she thought possible. Damon shouted behind her, but she managed to twist the knob and burst outside before he reached her. The cold night air stung her tear-streaked face as she stumbled toward her car. Her injured arm hung uselessly at her side as she slid into the driver's seat, her hands shaking so violently she almost dropped the keys. She turned the ignition with one hand, her breathing ragged, and sped down the driveway as Damon's furious shouts faded behind her. Tears blurred her vision, but she kept going, her heart pounding not for herself but for the tiny life inside her. Every bump in the road made her wince, every thought spiraled into fear. What if the stress hurt the baby? What if she collapsed before reaching help? Clutching the wheel with her good hand, she headed straight for the nearest hospital, praying she could make it before her body, or Damon, caught up with her. The hospital felt cold and overwhelmingly bright as Eleanor was rushed through the corridors, her broken arm cradled against her chest. Nurses asked questions she barely heard, their voices muffled by the pounding in her ears. She kept thinking of the baby, of the tiny flutter she had felt earlier, praying it meant the child was still safe. A nurse gently guided her into the radiology area, helping her onto the table. Eleanor swallowed hard, trying to steady her breathing, her entire body trembling from shock and pain. A moment later, the door opened, and the X-ray technician stepped inside with a clipboard in hand. He didn't look up at first, speaking automatically. "Mrs. Royce, I'm going to take," but when his eyes finally lifted to her face, he froze mid-sentence. The clipboard slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice cracking. Her heart lurched. She knew that voice. She knew those eyes. For a moment, she wondered if the pain had made her hallucinate. But there he stood, her older brother, Michael, the brother Damon had forced her to cut out of her life the moment they married. She hadn't seen him in nearly 3 years. Michael stepped closer, disbelief turning into horror as he took in the sight of her swollen, bruised arm, her pale face, the tear tracks on her cheeks. "What happened? Who did this?" His voice trembled with barely contained rage. Eleanor looked away, her lips quivering, unable to form the words. She didn't need to. Michael's eyes traveled over her injuries, the way she was shaking, the fear etched into her every movement. He knew. He understood instantly. In that small radiology room, the truth settled heavily between them. Damon had nearly destroyed her. And Michael, who had once promised to always protect her, realized he was about to keep that promise with a vengeance. Michael forced himself to take a slow breath, fighting the storm of fury rising in his chest. Years of medical training kicked in, allowing him to keep his voice steady even as his hands trembled with restrained anger. "Okay, Ellie. I'm going to adjust your arm gently, all right?" he murmured, as though she were the fragile child he used to carry on his shoulders. He touched her arm with a tenderness that made her crumble inside. He positioned her carefully for the X-ray, speaking softly, asking questions in the gentlest tone, how long she'd been hurt, whether she had fallen, if anyone was with her. Eleanor tried to answer, tried to pretend it wasn't that bad, but the words dissolved into sobs she couldn't control. She shook her head, whispering apologies through tears. Michael stepped closer, wiping her tears with his thumb the way he used to when she scraped her knee as a girl. "Don't apologize," he said, voice trembling, "you're safe now. I'm here. I'll take care of everything." It wasn't a promise, it was a vow. When he stepped out of the X-ray room, the door had barely closed before the comm mask shattered. His jaw tightened. His hands clenched. His breaths grew sharp with fury. He marched to the nurse's station and demanded hospital security at radiology immediately. Then he contacted the on-call domestic violence officer, insisting it was an emergency. They heard the urgency in his voice and didn't ask questions. But he wasn't done. Michael walked into an empty hallway, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number he never thought he'd use. His voice was dangerously steady when the call connected, rage sharpened into deadly purpose. He was going to make sure Damon Royce never touched his sister again. Michael's voice grew colder the longer he spoke on the phone, explaining Eleanor's condition with clinical precision that had none of his fury. He described the angle of the break, the bruising patterns, the swelling, details that, to trained ears, screamed violence. "She's pregnant," he added tightly. And he twisted her arm until it snapped. The silence on the other end lasted barely a second before the agent responded with urgency. Michael knew the law well enough to understand what this meant. When a pregnant woman is assaulted severely enough to break a bone, it becomes far more than domestic violence. It qualifies as aggravated assault, possibly attempted murder. And when the abuser is a wealthy, high-profile figure with the resources to flee or manipulate evidence, local police alone aren't enough. He requested immediate involvement from the FBI's Domestic Violence and High-Risk Victim Task Force, a division trained specifically to handle dangerous, influential offenders. The agent didn't hesitate. They promised to dispatch a team at once. Damon's name, reputation, and power weren't enough to slow them. In fact, they made the agents move faster. They'd seen wealthy men like him evade justice before. They weren't going to let it happen again. Michael leaned against the wall, staring at the floor as his anger simmered like molten metal. He remembered the day Eleanor got married, how she had smiled nervously, how she had insisted she'd be happy. He remembered the silent distance that grew after Damon forced her to cut ties. Now he understood every unanswered call, every missed birthday, every message that never came. His hand curled into a fist. This is attempted murder, he whispered to himself. And he would make sure the FBI treated it exactly that way. When Damon learned Eleanor had gone to the hospital, he didn't feel fear for her, only fear for himself. His heart pounded, but not with guilt. With calculation. Hospitals meant doctors. Doctors meant reports. Reports meant police. And police meant everything he'd worked for, his wealth, his reputation, his carefully crafted public image, could crumble in a single night. He grabbed his coat, cursing under his breath as he paced through the mansion. Stupid woman, he growled. Why couldn't she stay quiet? On the drive over, he practiced different versions of concern, experimenting with tones of voice and expressions in the rearview mirror. He forced tears, rehearsed shaky breaths, even tried a devastated whisper, "My poor wife, she fell, I should have been there." Nothing sounded perfect. He kept changing the story, maybe she slipped, maybe she fainted, maybe pregnancy weakened her bones. He'd choose whichever lie sounded most believable in the moment. He called his lawyer halfway there, barking orders to get ahead of the situation, demanding statements be prepared, threatening lawsuits against the hospital if anyone dared accuse him of wrongdoing. When he finally screeched into the hospital parking lot, he stormed inside with the confidence of a man used to being obeyed. "Where's my wife?" he snapped at the reception desk. "Bring her to me. Now." But before he could push further, 2 hospital security guards stepped into his path. "You can't go in, sir." Damon's voice rose immediately, rage bubbling over. "Do you know who I am? She's my wife. I demand to see her." His shouting echoed down the hallway, drawing wary stares from nurses, patients, and visitors. His face reddened, his fists clenched, and the scene grew louder and more chaotic, exactly the kind of spectacle that ensured he wouldn't be talking his way out of trouble tonight. The moment Damon's yelling reached its peak, the sliding doors at the entrance opened, and several figures in dark jackets stepped inside with purposeful strides. Their badges glinted under the hospital lights. The crowd parted instinctively as the FBI agents approached, already briefed and ready. Damon didn't even notice them until a firm hand gripped his shoulder. "Damon Royce?" one agent asked sharply. He spun around, startled. "What? Who are you?" "Federal Bureau of Investigation," the agent said, flashing her badge. "Step away from the hospital entrance immediately." Damon scoffed, trying to regain control. "This is ridiculous. My wife is inside. She needs me. I need to explain." "You will explain nothing," another agent interrupted, stepping closer. "Your wife is a victim of felony assault, and you are under federal investigation. You are not permitted to approach her." The words hit Damon like a slap. His face contorted, equal parts rage and panic. "Victim? Felony? Are you insane? She's pregnant and emotional, she exaggerates everything," he snapped desperately. "This is a misunderstanding. She gets dramatic when—" "Stop talking," the lead agent ordered sternly. "Your behavior is being recorded by hospital security. And any further attempts to intimidate staff will be added to the case." Damon's eyes darted around, noticing phones pointed at him, cameras blinking. His power was slipping through his fingers. In a final frantic attempt, he leaned close to the agent and whispered, "I can make this worth your time. Whatever you're being paid, I can pay more." The agents exchanged a look, pure disgust. "Attempting to bribe federal officers is a federal crime," one said coldly. "Keep talking, and you'll add more charges." Realizing he had no way out, Damon stumbled backward as the agents surrounded him, restraining his hands and guiding him toward the exit. His shouts turned frantic. "You can't do this. She's my wife. I control this family." But no one listened anymore. Cameras followed him, capturing every moment as the once invincible millionaire was escorted out of the hospital, exposed not as a husband, but as a violent criminal. With Michael seated beside her, Eleanor felt a fragile courage begin to bloom. The X-ray room, once sterile and intimidating, now felt like the first safe space she had known in months. She took a trembling breath and began to speak, her voice barely audible at first. She told Michael about the slaps, the controlling words, the nights she lay awake fearing he would come into the guest room and hurt her. She confessed to hiding bruises under long sleeves, applying layers of makeup, inventing excuses for friends who noticed, and fabricating stories to protect Damon's image. Each word felt like shedding a layer of shame and fear she had carried for years. Tears streamed freely, but Michael held her hand firmly, offering silent reassurance that she would no longer be silenced. The doctors and nurses carefully documented every injury and every account she gave. They photographed her arm, noted swelling, bruising, and emotional distress, and made sure her pregnancy was closely monitored. Each detail Eleanor shared became a crucial part of building a case. Simultaneously, FBI agents reviewed hospital footage, examining the timeline of her arrival, her visible injuries, and the statements made by staff. Her courage, combined with the physical evidence, was enough to transform suspicion into undeniable proof. For the first time in months, Eleanor felt a sense of empowerment. She was no longer hiding, no longer enduring silently. She was finally being heard, and with Michael's support, she realized that the nightmare she had lived through was beginning to unravel, and justice was slowly starting to take its first steps. Michael didn't waste a moment once the FBI had begun their investigation. He coordinated with victim protection services to ensure Eleanor would be moved to a secure, undisclosed location where no one, not Damon, nor anyone under his influence, could reach her. The house she had left behind, once opulent and imposing, was now irrelevant. Safety mattered more than wealth or comfort. The moment they arrived, Eleanor sank onto the bed, exhausted, finally allowing her body to relax after months of constant tension and fear. Doctors confirmed that both she and her baby were safe. Her heart, once so heavy with dread, felt lighter with every beat, knowing that medical professionals had assessed her condition and that no immediate danger remained. Tears flowed freely down her face as relief washed through her, mingling with the profound gratitude she felt toward Michael for never giving up on her. She whispered shaky thanks, her voice breaking with emotion. Michael knelt beside her, placing a steady hand on her shoulder. "No one will ever hurt you again," he promised, his tone unshakable. "I swear, Eleanor. You're safe now." Those words anchored her. After months of living in fear, hiding bruises, and walking on eggshells, Eleanor finally felt the weight of constant terror lift. She closed her eyes, finally able to breathe fully, knowing that her future and her baby's life were protected, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. News of Damon Royce's arrest spread faster than wildfire, consuming social media, news outlets, and business networks alike. Headlines screamed, "Millionaire arrested for breaking pregnant wife's arm," and instantly, the carefully constructed image of Damon as a successful, charming mogul began to crumble. Investors who had once clamored to back his projects withdrew overnight, unwilling to associate with a man whose personal life had erupted into violence so publicly. Sponsors who had paid handsomely for endorsements and appearances terminated their contracts immediately, citing reputational risk. Inside his company, employees whispered in hallways, sharing long-suppressed stories of Damon's explosive anger, manipulations, and cruel treatment of staff and family alike. What had once been carefully hidden behind the veneer of professionalism now emerged as undeniable truth. The office environment that had seemed untouchable began to crack, deals fell through, and a sense of panic replaced confidence in Damon's leadership. Court documents revealed the severity of his actions against Eleanor, and when he appeared before the judge, the courtroom atmosphere was tense. Damon, once commanding attention with ease, now looked small and rattled, his usual confidence stripped away. The judge considered the charges, the medical reports, and the testimony that had already begun to circulate publicly. Damon was denied bail, the court citing the risk he posed to Eleanor and the unborn child, and his public image, meticulously curated for years, was obliterated before he could even react. Overnight, Damon Royce ceased to be the untouchable millionaire. His empire, built on charisma and wealth, was shaking violently at its foundation, leaving him exposed, powerless, and facing the consequences of the violence he had inflicted. Eleanor entered the courtroom with a mixture of fear and determination, her hand lightly resting on her belly. Every step forward felt heavy with the weight of months of silence and pain, yet also empowering. This was her moment to reclaim her voice. She spoke with a strength she had never realized she possessed, recounting every instance of abuse, every time she had injuries, every moment Damon had controlled and threatened her. Her testimony was precise, yet laced with raw emotion, leaving the courtroom hushed. Michael sat in the front row, his presence a pillar of strength and protection. Around him, doctors, nurses, and FBI agents took the stand one by one. Each account reinforced Eleanor's story, the medical evidence, the X-ray images, the reports of staff, the documentation of bruising and emotional trauma, creating an undeniable web of proof. Damon sat silently, his face pale and contorted with frustration, as his carefully constructed image of dominance and control disintegrated in real time. The judge's voice carried through the courtroom, condemning Damon's actions as monstrous and unforgivable, emphasizing the severity of harming a pregnant woman and the breach of trust and morality such violence represented. Eleanor felt a swell of vindication as the sentence was read, a long prison term, ensuring Damon could no longer harm her or anyone else. Simultaneously, the court granted Eleanor full protection and control over shared assets, guaranteeing both her and her baby's safety. For the first time, she felt unburdened by fear, her courage validated, and her life, and that of her child, secured. The courtroom that once represented judgment and intimidation now symbolized justice, empowerment, and the hard-earned restoration of Eleanor's autonomy and peace. Eleanor's labor was long and exhausting, but the moment she held her baby in her arms, every pain and fear melted into a wave of pure, unfiltered joy. The baby's tiny fingers grasped hers, and she felt a love so deep it eclipsed every nightmare Damon had ever inflicted. Surrounded by family, including Michael, who never left her side, Eleanor finally felt the safety and unconditional love she had longed for during the darkest months of her life. The hospital room, once a place of fear, now resonated with laughter, soft coos, and tears of relief. The experience awakened a new purpose in Eleanor. She realized her story could empower others trapped in similar abusive marriages. Soon, she began speaking at events and community gatherings, sharing her experience and offering guidance to women who felt isolated, trapped, and powerless. Her voice, once quiet and hesitant, now carried authority, empathy, and the courage that had been forged in the crucible of her suffering. Meanwhile, Damon's presence in the public sphere diminished rapidly. Investors, sponsors, and social circles abandoned him, and his attempts at regaining influence were ignored. As he faded into irrelevance, Eleanor's strength and resilience rose in contrast. She embraced her newfound independence, not just as a survivor, but as a woman who had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her future. Every step she took forward felt like a declaration. She was no longer afraid, no longer controlled, and no longer defined by the man who had once tried to destroy her. Eleanor had emerged stronger, and this new life, filled with hope, protection, and love, was entirely her own. Eleanor eventually purchased a modest yet warm home, one that reflected comfort, security, and simplicity rather than ostentation. The house became a sanctuary for her and her baby, a place where laughter replaced fear and sunlight filled spaces once clouded by dread. Michael remained close, assisting with every detail, from baby care to household management, ensuring Eleanor's environment remained safe and nurturing. Within these walls, she slowly healed emotionally, confronting her past trauma while acknowledging the courage it had taken to survive. Each day brought a new sense of empowerment and peace. Her story began to resonate far beyond her immediate circle. Friends, colleagues, and strangers reached out, inspired by her strength and survival. Eleanor participated in interviews, wrote articles, and contributed to programs assisting victims of domestic abuse. She became a symbol of hope, courage, and resilience, reminding countless others that abuse could be overcome, and life could be reclaimed. Eleanor reflected on the moment Damon had broken her arm, the moment she had thought her life had ended. In hindsight, it was not an ending but a catalyst, a painful turning point that forced her to confront her situation and reclaim her power. The pain she endured became the foundation of her rebirth, one built on self-respect, protection, and love. With her baby in her arms and Michael by her side, she finally felt complete, secure, and truly free. The chapter that had once been defined by fear now concluded with justice, peace, and the promise of a bright, unshakable future.